Well, to discuss this, we're joined in Washington by law professor Dave Jonas, who Trump unsuccessfully nominated to be general counsel for the U.S. Department of Energy. Also in Washington, D.C. is Adam Weinstein, a policy associate at the National Iranian Council. And in New York is Amir Handjani. He's a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Adam Weinstein, if I can begin with you. So, Iran basically test firing new ballistic missiles. Is this a vindication that the United States was right to leave the Iran nuclear deal, or JCPOA? Or is it a negative symptom of the United States leaving the Iran deal? Which one is it?
I think it's a bit of both. Certainly, I believe it was a mistake to leave the JCPOA. It is true that Iran has always engaged in provocative behavior, but leaving the JCPOA unilaterally really weakened our leverage over Iran and ultimately weakened the U.S. sanctions regime. A good analogy would be when someone takes only some of their antibiotic and their immune system strengthens. And what has happened is that Iran has been pushed further east. Its relationships with China and Russia are improving, even its relationship with India. The U.S. isn't able to enact sanctions in the same hard-hitting way that it was able to do during the Obama administration. Evidence of that is that they granted a waiver for the Chabahar port project in Iran to India. And a big reason for that is the development of that project is crucial to security in Afghanistan. So what we see here is that the U.S. has left the JCPOA, emboldened Iran as a result, and undermined its own European allies.
Okay, Dave Jonas, leaving the Iran nuclear deal, imposing new sanctions, it's good for nobody, just makes things worse. Why do you disagree?
I disagree because it was, in my mind, the right thing to do. The deal was bad from the start. President Trump campaigned on the fact that it was a bad deal from the start, as he often said, the worst deal ever. And it's hard for me to argue with that. From a legal perspective, there's no question that it was an inappropriate deal. I recently completed a work on looking at all the American arms control treaties for years in the past, and virtually 98% of them were done as legally binding treaties. And this one, of course, was not even an executive agreement. It was a politically binding commitment. In other words, very little more than a handshake or a policy agreement. And so when one president makes such a weak agreement, which does essentially an end run around the U.S. Senate and its constitutional prerogatives, then they have no right to be upset when the next president, who campaigned on saying it was the worst deal ever, negates that deal. And he was, I believe, utterly right to do so.
Amir Handjani, when there are those who see the Iranians playing chicken with new missiles, they look at Iranian actions in Syria in supporting Bashar al-Assad, Iranian actions in Iraq, Iranian actions in Lebanon, supporting the Houthis in Yemen, and they say, come on, Obama must have been the stupidest leader ever to make a deal with these guys. Do they have a point?
Well, Iran was doing all those things before the nuclear deal, and they're doing all these things ever since the U.S. has pulled out of the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal was to take one issue and to essentially push it down the road 10 to 15 years, take it off the table, and give breathing room and space for diplomacy to engage in a whole host of other issues that trouble U.S. policymakers and the U.S. partners in the region. By unilaterally leaving the nuclear deal, just because President Trump said it's the worst deal ever, doesn't mean it was the worst deal ever. President Trump says a lot of things that turn out not to be true. I think by last count it was 6,000, or by the Washington Post, or 5,000, whatever. The IAEA, the global arms control community, has called it the gold standard of non-proliferation regime. Now, could it be strengthened? Absolutely. Are there loose ends to it? For sure. But the best way to address it is to stay in the deal where the U.S. has the most leverage. The U.S. has leverage when they're in the deal, pounding their fist at the table, working in concert with allies, with partners and allies, including the P5+1.
Okay.
Not by exiting and having Iran just get closer and closer to China, India, and Russia.
Okay, so Dave Jonas, so far there hasn't been any indication from the IAEA that Iran has resumed uranium enrichment or has got closer to the bomb, right? Tell me why you think France, the UK, Germany, Russia, and China are still sticking to their guns and still abiding by the deal and doing business with the Iranians. What don't they get that you get?
Certainly. Let me just correct one thing my colleague said. I don't believe the term gold standard has ever been applied to the deal itself. The gold standard term came from President Obama when he noted that the gold standard of nuclear agreements, which the United States usually uses in what are called 123 agreements for peaceful cooperation with other nations, is that we will not allow our fellow nations who we're making these deals with to enrich or reprocess. In other words, we won't allow them the path to a nuclear weapon. And by the way, Iran was offered that deal. They were offered access to a fuel bank, and as if they certainly don't need nuclear power as it is. They're sitting on a sea of oil. Nuclear power is very expensive compared to oil, and therefore that's one reason this is a horrible deal. The second reason is that the inspection regime, President Obama crossed two of his red lines, one of which was anytime, anywhere inspections. Instead, we have something like 24-day inspections. If you could imagine talking to a mobster and telling them, hey, we're going to come search your place in 24 days, don't change anything, don't move anything, you can see how ridiculous that is. And then even U.S. inspectors are not allowed in to inspect because of a ridiculous provision in the agreement that says that if there are no diplomatic relations with Iran, then those inspectors, even if they're attached to the International Atomic Energy Agency, if they're American, cannot inspect. If that's not a ridiculously bad deal, I don't know what is.
Let me go to Adam Weinstein and ask if Iran decides to leave the deal, what happens? Because we've got indications not just from the Supreme Leader, but even from President Rouhani, from the Foreign Minister Zarif, that the sanctions are making them fed up. They're getting annoyed at the fact that they see the Americans as provoking them constantly. So if they leave the deal with the other members of the JCPOA, what's that going to do, Adam?
Well, let me before I answer that, let me address one point that the law professor made, which I agree with. It would be great if legally binding agreements could be made, and unfortunately, we live in an era where executive power is such that a president can get the United States engaged in a protracted conflict that is almost impossible to leave, but it's extremely difficult to accomplish other foreign policy initiatives, especially diplomatic ones. And that's a testament to the bipartisan nature of our times, and that's been going on for at least a decade. To address your point, I don't think Iran will leave the JCPOA anytime soon, despite its tough talk. It wouldn't be in Iran's interest. Iran's not getting the full economic benefit that it was promised, but it's still getting economic benefits from Russia, India, China, and to a lesser extent, Europe. All leaving the JCPOA has done is weaken the United States sanctions regime, weaken the ability to inflict sanctions on other nations in the future, alienated our European allies, given Iran more leverage than ever before, and advanced China and Russia's pivot into the Middle East.
Amir Handjani, is that true? Does Iran actually have more leverage than it has ever had before?
I don't know if it has more leverage, but I agree with my colleague Adam that it's weakened. Look, the United States is still the global superpower and is able to exert a lot of pressure. And it certainly has and will be doing so, as we see with Iran today. However, we're going into we're moving from a unipolar world to a world of great power competition. And in this world of great power competition, Russia and China, India, other players are going to come in and fill the vacuum that the United States has, over time, been withdrawing from. We see Russian involvement in the Middle East. We see China getting involved in the Horn of Africa with a base there. Both Russia and China view Iran as a security partner. They view its economy as essential to an export market. They view it as a stabilizing force, quite the opposite of the United States in the Middle East. And this great era of great power competition allows for Iran to essentially play spoiler. And that's what it's doing. However, it's doing so on the U.S.'s dime, because You also have an issue right now between the U.S. and its European allies and partners. They are, I wouldn't say siding with Iran, but at least staying in the deal and trying to make the deal work in spite of the United States. We've never really seen that before.
Dave Jonas, from the Iranian perspective, they saw the United States invade Iraq, invade Afghanistan, have bases in a handful of countries surrounding it, encircling it, more than a dozen bases. It would be the equivalent of the Iranians having bases in Canada and Mexico and all along the US coast. Why shouldn't the Iranians try to protect and defend themselves from American power?
That's a fair point. I mean, they're certainly not viewed as an ally of America. They're viewed as I certainly view them as an enemy state. But I think that the issue that President Trump wanted to come across is not that he was withdrawing from the deal and walking away, but that he wanted to negotiate a better deal. And I think that can be done. In other words, some of the many problems with the deal are the deal fails to recognize that Iran already has a legally binding commitment to not to pursue nuclear weapons, and that's through its obligations in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that has been in existence since 1970. And yet in this agreement, Iran makes that promise, the most important promise, not to make nuclear weapons, in the least binding part of the agreement. In other words, the agreement is not legally binding itself, but preambles to agreements are not binding at all, even in legally binding agreements. They're merely aspirational, whereas any binding commitments come across in the operative paragraphs of a treaty or an agreement or a political agreement, which is what this is. Now, America observes its political agreements as if they were legally binding. But a state like Iran, which has continually ignored its legally binding commitments, both through UN Security Council Resolution 1929, which instructed it not to enrich uranium, and in its safeguards agreement with the IAEA, in which it was supposed to report any nuclear activity that it had going on for 20 years, which it failed to do. It's hard to see how Iran, in ignoring legally binding obligations, would scrupulously observe a non-legally binding obligation such as this deal. And that's why it could be made stronger and better. And I think that's what President Trump wants to do with this deal.
Amir, do you trust that President Trump wants a better deal?
Only President Trump can answer that, but just to get to answer a question my colleague has raised. No, the U.S. has, under President Trump, exited from a whole host of political binding agreements and arms control agreements. We're just about to exit the INF treaty. In fact, even if you had a treaty that was legally binding and passed by the Senate, the next president can simply exit that treaty by notifying the Senate that it's no longer in the U.S. interest to abide by that treaty. There have been a whole host of treaties that President Trump, political, not even call them legal binding, let's go political. You can start with the Paris Climate Accords, the Post Office agreement, which is bizarre. I mean, he is essentially taking a hammer to the global security architecture by exiting from deals that, for the last 70 years, that have made the United States safer and more robust.
Gentlemen, I've got to wrap, but it's been good to talk to all of you. Amir Handjani, Adam Weinstein, and Dave Jonas, thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.